We like to believe that we have conquered the planet. We build towers that scrape the stratosphere. We split the atom. We turn the night into day. But there is a terrifying truth that history tries to forget. A truth that proves our entire civilization is nothing more than a thin layer of heat, hovering over a ball of ice. In March of 1888, the richest, most advanced city on Earth didn't just stop. It vanished. In 24 hours, the stock market froze. The government collapsed, and the most powerful men in America were found dead just feet from their own front doors. This isn't a story about a snowstorm. This is the story of the day the machines failed, the lights went out, and the modern world finally met its match. In the late 19th century, America was a nation intoxicated by its own progress. The Gilded Age was at its zenith, and the smoke from thousands of factory chimneys signaled a world that had finally, through the sheer force of steel and steam, conquered the natural world. By March of 1888, the citizens of the great American East were looking toward the horizon, waiting for the first signs of spring. They believed they were living in an era where the elements were merely a backdrop to human industry, an inconvenience to be managed by the telegraph and the locomotive. They were wrong. The weekend of March 10th began with a strange, unseasonable warmth. In New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, the air was thick and humid, more reminiscent of a late April afternoon than the brutal winters of the North. People walked the streets in light coats, discussing the coming baseball season and the rising stock prices of the railroad empires. The weather forecast, such as it was in those days, predicted a mild spring rain. There was no warning of the atmospheric collision brewing just out of sight. High above the continent, a massive, slow-moving Arctic high-pressure system was sliding down from the Canadian tundra, heavy with sub-zero air. At the same time, a violent, moisture-laden, warm front was surging up from the Gulf Stream. These two giants were on a collision course over the eastern seaboard, and the point of impact would be the most densely populated corridor in the Western world. As the sun went down on Sunday, March 11th, the rain began. It was a heavy, cold soak that turned the cobblestone streets into rivers of slush. But as midnight approached, the physics of the atmosphere shifted with a violent suddenness. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. Within a matter of hours, a 40-degree plunge turned the driving rain into needles of ice, and then into a blinding, suffocating blanket of white. By the time the sun should have risen on Monday morning, there was no sun to be found. Instead, there was only the white hurricane. Monday, March 12th, remains one of the most surreal days in American history. Thousands of workers, driven by the relentless work ethic of the Victorian era, stepped out of their front doors into a world that had become unrecognizable. They assumed, with a misplaced faith in their infrastructure, that the city would still function. They headed for the elevated trains, the L's, which were the pride of New York City's transport system. These steam-powered locomotives chugged along tracks suspended 30 feet above the ground, symbols of a city that had risen above the mud. But the white hurricane didn't care for symbols. As the winds intensified to 80 miles per hour, the snow wasn't falling in flakes. It was moving horizontally, like a solid wall of frozen debris. The elevated trains groaned and finally shuddered to a halt, trapped on their high iron perches. Thousands of commuters were now suspended in mid-air, huddled in unheated wooden cars, while the wind threatened to blow the entire structure into the abyss below. On the ground, the situation was even more dire. The snowdrifts were growing at a rate of an inch every few minutes, soon reaching heights of 10, 15, and 20 feet. These weren't just drifts. They were barricades that sealed the doors of tenement houses and brownstones alike, turning homes into prisons. The most terrifying aspect of the storm's first hours was the total and instantaneous death of communication. In 1888, the Internet of the age was the telegraph. Every major city was draped in a chaotic web of thousands of overhead wires, strung from poles that leaned precariously over the crowded streets. These wires carried the heartbeat of the nation, the stock tickers, the news of the world, and the emergency signals of the fire departments. As the ice coated these wires, they grew to the thickness of a man's arm. One by one, then by the hundreds, the poles began to snap under the impossible weight. The sound was described by survivors as a series of pistol shots echoing through the whiteout. As the wires fell, they hissed and sparked in the snow, creating a lethal labyrinth for anyone brave or foolish enough to be outside. In a single morning, the most connected region on Earth was plunged into a pre-industrial silence. New York could not talk to Boston. Philadelphia could not signal Washington. The great American metropolis was no longer a hub of global trade. It was a collection of isolated, freezing islands, cut off from the world and from itself. The arrogance of the Gilded Age had been stripped away in a matter of hours, leaving a modern civilization to face the raw, prehistoric power of a winter that had decided to reclaim the land. The streets, once vibrant with the sound of commerce, were now silent except for the roar of the wind. Visibility was reduced to zero. Men lost their way trying to cross a street they had walked for 20 years, wandering in circles until the cold drained the life from their limbs. This was the moment the realization set in. The machines had failed. The steam engines were buried, the wires were severed, and the horses were drowning in the drifts. America wasn't just having a snowstorm. It was experiencing a total systemic meltdown. By the second day of the storm, the white hurricane had transitioned from a meteorological event into a state of total siege. The great American cities of the Northeast were no longer functioning societies. They had become urban graveyards, buried under a weight of snow that defied the imagination. In New York City, the sheer volume of the drifts had reached a surreal scale. People looked out from their second- and third-story windows, only to see a wall of white staring back at them. The streets were gone. The landmarks were erased. The geometric precision of the Manhattan grid had been swallowed by a primordial, undulating landscape of ice. This was the moment of the great interment. Tens of thousands of people were trapped inside buildings that were rapidly losing the war against the cold. In the 1880s, the lifeblood of the city was coal. Every furnace, every stove, and every engine required a constant daily delivery of black stone to keep the darkness at bay. But with the railroads paralyzed and the horse-drawn wagons buried to their necks in snow, the supply chain simply evaporated. The temperature inside the tenements and brownstones began to mirror the sub-zero air outside. Families huddled together, burning furniture and floorboards in a desperate attempt to stay alive, watching as frost began to grow on the inside of their parlor walls. But a far more terrifying threat was lurking beneath the snow, the threat of fire. In the late 19th century, American cities were largely constructed of wood and cloth, lit by gas lamps and heated by open coal fires. Under normal conditions, the fire department was the pride of the city, a high-speed, horse-drawn force that could reach any blaze in minutes. But on March 13th, the fire department was non-existent. The horses, powerful beasts capable of pulling tons, were helpless. They would collapse into the drifts, their hearts bursting from the effort, until they were left to freeze where they fell. When fires inevitably broke out in the crowded districts of the Lower East Side, the city faced a nightmare scenario. People watched from their windows as entire buildings were consumed by flames, knowing that no help was coming. The water in the hydrants was frozen solid. The firemen could only stand by, shovels in hand, watching the orange glow of the inferno reflect off the white walls of the blizzard. It was a scene of medieval helplessness in the heart of the world's most modern city. The social fabric began to fray under the pressure of the famine. In 1888, there was no such thing as a supermarket or home refrigeration. The city lived on a just-in-time delivery system of fresh milk, bread, and meat brought in daily from the surrounding countryside. When the trains stopped, the food stopped. Within 48 hours, the price of a single loaf of bread skyrocketed to a week's wages for a laborer. A black market emerged instantly, with men fighting in the streets over scraps of food or a single bucket of coal. The desperation was not limited to the poor. The crisis was a great leveler. proving that in the face of a total systemic collapse, wealth was a useless abstraction. You could have a pocket full of gold, but if there was no coal to buy and no path to the store, you were just as cold as the beggar in the alley. The human cost of this isolation was personified in the tragic figure of Roscoe Conkling, a titan of American politics, a former U.S. senator, and one of the most powerful men in the country. Conkling was a man who believed in the absolute triumph of the will. On that Tuesday, he refused to let the storm dictate his life and attempted to walk from his law office at Wall Street to his club at Madison Square. It was a distance of only a few miles, a walk he had done 1,000 times. But the white hurricane transformed those few miles into a frozen wilderness. Conkling spent 3 hours fighting through drifts that reached his chest, his breath freezing in his lungs, his orientation completely lost in the whiteout. He eventually collapsed, and though he was rescued, the damage to his body was irreversible. He died shortly after from the effects of the exposure. If the storm could strike down a giant like Conkling, what hope was there for the thousands of anonymous souls lost in the slums? As the blizzard finally began to wind down, the silence that followed was even more haunting than the roar of the wind. The city was a monochrome world of white and shadow. To move at all, people had to become burrowers. Men and boys emerged with shovels, not to clear the streets, that was an impossible task, but to dig tunnels. For days, the primary mode of transportation in New York City was a network of subterranean snow tunnels, some stretching for entire blocks, connecting one island of survival to another. In these tunnels, people passed each other like ghosts, moving through the belly of the storm's remains. Beneath the snow, the city was discovering its dead. As the shovels hit the pavement, they found the frozen statues, men who had sat down for a moment to rest and never got back up, delivery boys still clutching their packages, and horses still hitched to their buried wagons. The estimates of the dead began to climb into the hundreds, but the true number would never be known. The blizzard had not just killed people. It had stopped the heart of a civilization. The great American East had been humbled. The machines had failed, the systems had collapsed, and the invincible infrastructure of the 19th century had been revealed as a fragile illusion. The survivors looked at their buried world and realized that if they were to continue as a modern society, they could never again allow themselves to be this vulnerable to the sky. The very foundation of how a city was built was about to be challenged. When the sun finally broke through the clouds on the 4th day, it did not bring relief so much as it brought a grisly revelation. The white hurricane had passed, leaving behind a landscape that looked less like a city and more like the aftermath of a glacial bombardment. But as the temperatures rose and the great thaw began, the city of New York was forced to confront the true magnitude of the catastrophe. The melting snow didn't just wash away the memory of the storm, it unveiled the dead. As the 50-foot drifts turned into rivers of slush and mud, the city's laborers began the grim task of excavation. They found the frozen statues, mentioned in the whispers of the survivors' men and women who had collapsed from exhaustion just yards from safety, buried where they fell. But the carnage was not limited to humans. The streets were littered with the carcasses of thousands of horses, the engines of the 19th century economy, frozen stiff in their harnesses. The smell of decay began to mix with the smell of the mud, a sensory reminder of the failure of the old world. The economic toll was equally staggering. In a matter of days, the storm had wiped out tens of millions of dollars in commerce, a sum that would be in the billions today. The stock market had been paralyzed, international trade had ceased, and the rail lines, the arteries of the nation, were twisted wrecks of steel and ice. This moment of destruction, however, became the catalyst for one of the most significant engineering revolutions in human history. The blizzard had proven a singular, terrifying fact. The infrastructure of the Gilded Age was incompatible with the reality of nature. The forest of poles that had held the telegraph and electrical wires was identified as the primary villain. These overhead lines, which had snapped and hissed like venomous snakes during the storm, had not only cut off communication, but had physically blocked the streets, preventing fire wagons and food deliveries from moving. The city's leadership, driven by a mix of embarrassment and fear, made a decision that would physically alter the appearance of every modern city on Earth. They declared that the sky was no longer a safe place for the nervous system of civilization. The order was given: bury the wires. It was a massive, expensive undertaking, fought against by the powerful utility monopolies, but the memory of the silence of March 12th was too fresh to ignore. Gangs of men tore down the wooden poles that had defined the Victorian skyline, and for the first time the wires were laid into conduit pipes beneath the pavement. The city was cleaning up its skyline, but more importantly, it was hardening its shell. This was the birth of the modern streetscape, clean, open, and deceptively simple, hiding its complexity underground. But the most profound legacy of the White Hurricane was not the wires. It was the rails. The paralysis of the elevated trains, those steam engines, trapped helplessly on their tracks above the street, had traumatized the commuting public. The city realized it could not rely on a transport system exposed to the elements. The debate over rapid transit, which had stalled in political deadlock for decades, ended overnight. The argument was no longer about cost. It was about survival. The cry went up for a system that was immune to the wind, the snow, and the ice. The city had to go down. In the wake of the blizzard, the plans for the Interborough Rapid Transit Company were accelerated with a desperate urgency. The Great Blizzard of 1888 is the direct father of the New York City subway system. The engineers and planners who designed the underground labyrinth did so with the specific goal of creating a subterranean world where the weather did not exist. Every time a modern commuter steps onto a subway platform, they are standing in a monument to the fear generated by that single week in March. The city had decided to retreat from the surface to ensure its continuity. As we look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, the White Hurricane serves as a haunting mirror to our own fragility. We like to believe that we have surpassed the vulnerabilities of our ancestors, that our technology has tamed the planet. But in reality, we have only traded one set of weaknesses for another. In 1888, they lost telegraph wires and coal deliveries. Today, a storm of that magnitude would attack a power grid that is infinitely more complex and arguably more fragile. We rely on just-in-time supply chains that are leaner and faster than the railroads of the 19th century, but also far less resilient to disruption. A week without power today does not just mean a cold house. It means the collapse of digital banking, the failure of water filtration systems, and the cessation of the Internet. The blizzard of 1888 was not just a weather event. It was a warning shot across the bow of industrial civilization. It taught us that no matter how high we build our towers or how fast we send our signals, we are tenants on this planet, not masters of it. The storm forced us to bury our veins and arteries deep within the earth, to hide our vital systems from the sky. It reshaped our architecture, our government, and our engineering. But the snows of 1888 eventually melted. The lesson, however, remains frozen in the bedrock of our cities. The systems we build are only as strong as their weakest day, and the sky is always waiting for the moment we forget to look up.